brought the whole story right up to the burial of Christ. You remember that John's Gospel has a little different approach to things. In John's Gospel, they actually get to anoint Jesus, wrap him in a burial wrappings, prepare him totally for burial, and put him in the tomb before there's any problem. So everything is done in John's Gospel. On the first day of the week, at or about sunrise, Mary Magdalene goes to the garden. Now, in the other three Gospels, Mary Magdalene and some of the other women go to the garden because it's their job now to prepare the body for permanent burial. In John's Gospel, that's already been done. So Mary Magdalene does not go to the garden to prepare the body of Jesus. There's nothing to prepare. Mary goes to the garden simply because she loves the Lord. That's the only reason she's there. That and the fact that she is going to be the first witness to his resurrection. She goes into the garden, finds the stone rolled away from the tomb, and she runs and tells the disciples. And they come to the garden. Two of them, at any rate, Peter and John. Whenever John says, and the other disciples, he means himself. He doesn't write in the third person, or he doesn't write in first person, he writes in third person. So, John and Peter run out to the garden to see what has happened to Jesus. And they look in the tomb and they find a couple of things. And this is kind of an important piece in John's Gospel. Peter looks in the tomb first, and he finds the wrappings. That is, those bands of fabric about that wide in which the body was wrapped, kind of Egyptian style, only without the mummification, just the wrapping. He finds those, but there's no body there. So Peter is in a situation where he has no idea of what has happened, other than that the body is gone. John then goes in and he looks and he believes. That, to me, is kind of an odd statement, which means you need to look at it in John's Gospel. Peter believes that somebody has stolen Jesus' body. Peter does not at this point believe in the resurrection. He just believes that the body's gone. John, on the other hand, goes into the tomb and for some reason or another believes that Jesus is alive. Now, what is it that makes John believe that reality? He doesn't say. Those who proclaimed the gospel in the Celtic world thought that John, having known the heartbeat of Christ, remember in John's Gospel, the Apostle John is leaning upon the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. And he hears the heartbeat of God. And he hears it again in the tomb. Nobody knows whether that's what John meant or not. But that's what the Celtic people took it to mean. That John heard the living heartbeat of Christ and so knew and believed. Peter and John then return to their homes, but Mary stays behind. And she stands there weeping. And as she weeps, she goes into the tomb and has a vision of angels. And they say, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she says to them exactly what Peter would have said. "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have put him." And then she turns around and sees a man. Thinking him to be the gardener, she doesn't say much or do much. But Jesus asks her, as did the angels, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" And supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." At this point, John is the only one who believes. Everybody else believes that something happened to the body of Jesus, but they've got no clue what. And then Jesus says to her, "Mary." And immediately she knows. She responds with the simple word, Rabboni, which means teacher. Or to the Celtic people, you would translate it Druid. Because that's what the Druids were. They were the teachers of the people. This is why Columba and Patrick both call Jesus their Druid. Rather amazing, isn't it? It means the same thing in the Celtic framework that Rabboni means in the Jewish framework. Rather interesting. Jesus reveals himself to Mary, and she is the first one who sees and believes. And she runs to tell the disciples that I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said all these things to her. She is the first witness of the resurrection, which is the definition of an apostle. One who witnesses to the Lord's resurrection. She is the first of the apostles, not Peter. Interesting. Peter doesn't have much of a position in John's gospel. Then we get to the gospel for this morning. Jesus, as he does elsewhere, shows up in the midst of his disciples, and he says, "Peace I leave with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." Can you imagine what the apostles might have felt seeing Jesus standing there in front of them? They haven't got a good track record. John is the only one out of the whole batch that stood at the foot of the cross. Everybody else ran away. Peter denied Jesus. And now he's standing there right in front of them. Oh, nervous time. And so he says, "Peace be with you." Don't worry. Don't be afraid. It's okay. He needs them to be at peace with all that's gone on. And then he says, "As the Father sent me, I send you." Just like the Father's job for Jesus, that's the job he now gives us. To reconcile all the world to God. What an amazing job description we have. It's no little task to reconcile the world to God. But Jesus offers them a way in which they can do that. He says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." He breathes on them. God breathed on the waters in the creation of the world. It was by the breath of God that we became living creatures. And that same breath that brooded over the waters in creation now flows into the disciples and us. Then John places this marvelous statement, which is unique in John. He says, "If you forgive the sins," plural, only time in John's gospel that we get a plural for sin. Very strange. "If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." In the other Gospels, he gives that to Peter. He says to Peter, "You are the rock on which I will build my church. Here are the keys to the kingdom of God. If you forgive the sins of anyone, they will be future forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they will be future forgiven." But in John's Gospel, this is simply said to all who have gathered in that upper room. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain, they are retained. Not will be. Nor does John use that classic phrase, "into the age," by which he means throughout eternity. This is a here and now. Thomas is not there. So Thomas doesn't get to see and hear and feel. Now, one of the things that we forget conveniently when we're reading this passage from John's Gospel is the first thing Jesus says or does is shows them, "Here, look at my hands. Look at my feet. See? It's me." That's the first thing he does. He wants them to know that it's the risen Lord. They have all been able to see and touch. But Thomas isn't with them. So Jesus comes back a week later. We're now into the second Sunday of Easter, and says, Thomas, you weren't here, so you get the same opportunity that I gave them. Thomas is not unique in his doubting. Thomas is just late in his believing. He wasn't there. So God gives Thomas a chance to see and believe. It's a marvelous description of how patient God is with us. You know, if you open your eyes, you see a miracle. Period. No matter where you are or what's going on in your life, you see a miracle. Only you don't recognize it for what it is. When you walk outside and you see the flowers on these shrubs over here, you see a miracle. But it's just a shrub. So you don't see what's right in front of your eyes. So Jesus very patiently keeps putting things in front of us, so that eventually, even in our slowness, we see the miracle of God. That's what he's doing with Thomas. And that's what he does with us. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the whole purpose of the Gospel of John, so that people might believe in Jesus. He is not writing a theological treatise to make sure that the church believes in the right things. He's writing this gospel so that people can believe in Jesus. So obviously, I think he's writing this gospel in this way so that a particular group of people might believe. He's obviously not writing this so that the Jews will believe. He's obviously not writing this so that the Romans will believe, or the Greeks. He's writing this so that a people of Asia Minor might believe. And they did. And they carried it with them all the way to the British Isles. They were the Celts. They saw and believed. Chapter 21 is really an interesting piece. The disciples are fishing. Nowhere until the last chapter of John do we have any clue that any of them were ever fishermen. We do not have Jesus walking up to Peter and Andrew and saying, "Cast your nets on the other side and you'll catch a great number of fish." Not there, where it is in the other Gospels. We don't have him walking up to James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and saying, "Follow me." It's not in John's Gospel. But it all takes place not to call them originally, but as a resurrection experience of Christ. That's unique in John. So it's something we need to pay attention to. Whenever there's a unique piece in John, you want to look at it carefully. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said, we will go with you. They went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Now you will remember from the other Gospels that that's what happened with the call of Peter and Andrew. But this is a resurrection experience. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? And they answered him, no. I mean, they've been out there all night. They're tired. They're grumpy. They're grouchy. They've got nothing. They say, no. And he said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. Then John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, it's the Lord! When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes because he'd stripped down to his loincloth to work. So he put on some clothes, dove into the sea, and swam to the shore to be with Jesus. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards. They can't pull all those fish into the boat, so they simply have to drag it behind them as they go to the shore. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus has provided for their necessities. He's got breakfast ready for them. He's got bread, he's got fish. What more can you use? But Jesus says, bring some of the fish you have caught. You need to start providing for people. You need to start a Jacob's Kitchen. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 fish.
So they counted them first.
They counted them. 153. Now, where's that number come from?
Yeah.
Somebody has suggested, and whether they're right or not, I don't know, but somebody has suggested that there were 153 countable groups of people and dialects known in that part of the world. So Peter and the disciples are bringing one of every group of people that are known to Christ. See what's going on? They've got a job. They are not just to provide for people, they are to bring people to Christ of every language, tribe, and nation. Every single one of them. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. He doesn't need to cook the fish. He just needs them to bring the fish. It's a lesson for us. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, and this only occurs in John's Gospel, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Peter says to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to them, "Feed my lambs." A second time Jesus said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Jesus said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter felt hurt because Jesus said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to Jesus, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now, I don't know whether you've ever heard anybody preach that passage from John before. But 9 times out of 10, they will tell you, well, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Now Jesus gives him the opportunity 3 times to say, "I love you." It's a balance. But what they miss is that it's not in those words that the message is covered. It's in the word love. We think Jesus asked the same question 3 times, and that Peter responded in the same way 3 times. Not so. Here's the process. Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" And the word Jesus uses, is agape. Do you love me the way that I have loved you? You love me like God loves you. And Peter says, "Lord, I love you like a brother." And Jesus says, "That's not quite what I asked for." He says, "Peter, do you love me in the same way that I have loved you?" And Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, I love you like a brother." Now you would think at this point that Jesus would say, "Peter, wake up! Listen to what I'm saying," and then respond appropriately. But Jesus doesn't do that. The third time that Jesus asks the question, and here's the kicker. He says, "Peter, do you love me like a brother?" And Peter responds, "You know I love you like a brother." See what's happened? It's not Peter who changes. It's Jesus who says, "You're not quite ready yet. But you know, take what you have." If this is the only way you can love now, I'll take it. I will accept you where you are in your life with me. And that's okay. You'll get there. But for now, I'll accept the love of a brother rather than the love of God. It's amazing, isn't it? It's the word love. It's not the number of times he asks. It's what he asks. It's not what we respond with. It's what he responds with. It's an amazing piece. But you got to look at that word love in the Greek. But then Jesus says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus realizes that Peter will not get to that point in his life that Jesus wants him to be in until the very end. But he knows that Peter will come around. When Peter is an old man, they arrest him in Rome and they crucify him. And he finally knows what it is to love like God loves. There's an amazing old story, and it's not a biblical story, it's just an old story in the church about Peter's death. Peter finds out that they're coming to haul him off and kill him. And so Peter, as Peter so often does, heads for the highway. He says, I'm getting out of here before they come close. And as he's leaving Rome, he meets Jesus coming into Rome. And Peter says, "Oh Lord, don't go there. You know what they're doing back there? They're crucifying Christians. You don't want to go near." And Jesus says, one of us has to go. Who's it going to be? And Peter turns around and goes back into Rome. Now he knows what it is that Christ was asking him to do. Do you love me in the same way that I love you? And finally, at long last, Peter can say, "Yes, Lord, I love you in the same way that you love me." Isn't that amazing? Then we have this little vignette at the end, and I'm not sure where this vignette comes from. Peter turns and sees John following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper, and he said, "Lord, who is it that's going to betray you?" So we know this is John himself. When Peter saw John, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him? What's going to happen to John?" John is the youngest of the disciples, probably just into Jewish manhood when he starts following Jesus. Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that John remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would never die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Now, one of the realities is that John becomes the only living disciple. By the time John is an old man, dying on his bed in his own house, all of the other disciples are dead and gone. They have all been killed and martyred for the sake of Christ, and only John is left alive. So people started wondering, what's going on? Why is John still alive when everybody else has died? And somehow, you gotta explain that. So this becomes John's way of explaining why he is still alive and everybody else is dead and gone. Or it may be that this was an addition to the gospel and John didn't write this piece at all, but rather one of John's disciples wrote that in to explain why John was still alive. Then John says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." John has picked and chosen from all of his experiences with Christ those which will help this people believe. He is not attempting, like Luke does, to do a beginning to end story about the history of Jesus. He's not a biographer. That's not his intent. His intent is to write down the things that will help this people believe. And we have those things in John's Gospel. So, that is, as they say, that. John's Gospel is now over. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a few things. And that as you look at John's Gospel, you're going to find even more things. Because we've really only scratched the surface. I could spend 3 years on John's Gospel. But that would not be terribly helpful. So, at any rate, thank you all.